Great. Thank you for the invite. The paper I'm presenting is actually a report that's already been published a couple of weeks ago. We published it a bit early. We were hoping that we would do this presentation beforehand, but the good people at GNet were much more effective and quick in proofreading and doing all that sort of stuff. So, and really, I could just take a minute or two and tell you guys to read the report, and then we could all sit silently for 15 minutes. But the chair has told me that if I do that, I'd never be invited again. So this report is written by myself, my colleague Chelsea Damon at American University, who's a brilliant scholar that looks at Telegram and digital extremist sphere, and Émile Archambault at the University of Ottawa, who is a political theorist and a drone scholar. So a bit of an eclectic mix, but I think it makes sense in how we've kind of brought people together. And the clicker doesn't work. So thanks to the funders for this report, so GNet and the good people at the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism. Needless to say, these are our ideas, and they don't necessarily represent those of our funders. But yeah, so essentially the report tries to do a couple things. And what we're interested in understanding is how terrorist groups learn from their adversaries when it comes to the different techniques, the tactics, and the procedures that they employ. Now, in 2011, Andrew Silk wrote what I think is a fairly important piece, which was about like the 10 understudied elements or areas in terrorism research. And one of the areas that he identified was the notion of terrorist learning. So how is it that terrorists change their modus operandi? How is it that they learn? How do they innovate? And this is a field which I think luckily has improved a great deal in the last 10 years. We've had some brilliant work. So Adam Dolnick has written his Understanding Terrorist Innovation. Audrey Croning, her fantastic book, Power to the People. And then some self-promotion, because I'm still dreaming of retiring at 30 on royalties. My book, How Terror Evolved. But essentially, what's quite interesting with a lot of the literature that's coming out on terrorist innovation and terrorist learning is that we are focusing on the existence of what we call relational ties. So essentially how groups which have similar objectives, similar strategies, similar outlooks might work together in order to achieve their outcome goals or their process goals. So we can see, for example, from terrorism history, I think most of us are aware that in the 1970s, you had all these different leftist groups hanging out in the deserts of Jordan, sharing techniques, sharing knowledge, and so on. And that makes a lot of sense. But what we're starting to see more and more is a diffusion of techniques amongst groups which are not ideologically aligned. Where, for example, if we take vehicle ramming, which is a technique that we see emerging from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, eventually being diffused to the repertoire of the jihadi Salafists, and then now being adopted with gusto by the far right. Over 100 vehicle ramming attacks during the context of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. It's not like members of the far right are sitting down in a pub with members of ISIS and saying, "Hey, tell us how you are doing this. Share this information." So what are the mechanisms that allows for this transfer of information, this transfer of TTP to occur? So that's one of the things we are interested in understanding. With that was building a framework that would essentially help us to understand what are the factors that might propel or hinder this terrorist adoption of emerging technologies. And this is one of the things I'm going to talk about in the report. This is the part that I'm particularly interested in, is a kind of pushing the theory in this. And then what we did is we played to our strength, and then we tried to kind of test out this theoretical framework using 3 different case studies. So the first one, looking at cloud messaging apps, things like Telegram. This is some of the work that Chelsea has done. Looking at the weaponization of drones, so some of the work that I've done with Émile. And then lastly, looking at social media bots. And this one was kind of a particularly interesting aspect for us because this is one of the things that was essentially requested by some of the stakeholders that we talked about as kind of like the next frontier, right? So whereas cloud messaging app and weaponization of drones we can see happening a great deal, we also have this body of literature on the topic. This notion of social media bots was largely underexplored, so there was kind of not quite a counterfactual, but at the very least a case study that was more in its infancy. So that we thought was quite interesting. So the report itself has a couple of goals. So firstly, we're interested in kind of like tracing how these racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists have adopted or failed to adopt various techniques, tactics, and procedures that appear to have originated from the Islamic State. And then lastly is understanding the different factors that comes into play. And we broke these down into 3 sets of factors. So the first one has to do with the technical factors, and these are related to the technique itself, to the emerging technology itself, the characteristic of the thing that is being transferred. The second has to do with the group factors. So what internal or societal factors might have influenced the decision of these groups to adopt these techniques, because these groups are seen as rational actors. And then how is this technique transferred? So how does this knowledge take place? So the framework we build essentially looks at these 3 kind of broad categories with, I think, 9 different elements. Yeah, I think it's 9, maybe 7. I don't know. We'll see in a minute. But let me kind of talk you through some of the thinking here. So when we're looking at the characteristics of the techniques, we identified 3 variables that we thought was interesting. So the first one had to do with how compatible a particular technique was to the existing techniques within a group's repertoire of contention. And essentially the thinking behind this is that if a technique, if a procedure or a tactic was similar to something that they already do, the barrier for adoption would be lesser. So for example, a group which has had experience with biological weapons, for example, would have an easier time to develop chemical weapons than a group which is only engaged in the use of, contemporary weapons or more common weapons, if you will. So if you kind of look at like a group like Shamrikyo, it's not uncommon that they essentially looked at both chemical and biological because they had that acquired knowledge. At the same time as well, we're going with the idea that these techniques and these procedures and these tactics will be easier to adapt if you can kind of slot them into existing procedures and system. The second one has to do with complexity. And this is, again, a fairly kind of straightforward way of looking at this, but I think it's helpful when we're kind of trying to break down this complicated system, which is this transfer of information between 2 groups of individuals. And that essentially simply has to do with like how complex is this technique? How much knowledge is required by a group in order to adapt a new way of acting? And this becomes quite interesting in the sense that if a technique is particularly complex, there's a much higher operating cost and there's a much higher risk that this technique, if this technique fails, the group isn't going to be able to recover from this failure. And this is something I talk about in my book, How Terror Evolves, where essentially I demonstrate that groups that have employed airplane hijacking and failed to do so in their first 2 attempts largely stopped operating afterwards. Airplane hijacking is an extremely costly and complex technique to undertake, much more so than a car bomb is something. So therefore, the operating costs of going and attempting to hijack an airplane means that you're putting you've got a lot more at stake. And then we also have questions of resources, right? And essentially this has to do with like the feasibility. So certain techniques might seem quite appealing to a particular group, but simply are just too resource intensive for a group to decide to operate on them. And this is actually quite interesting because this is where like a lot of the counterterrorism or like the proactive counterterrorism comes in, is attempting to increase the barrier for a particular technique by increasing the cost and the resource that is required. And this is where things like FATF come from, and also making certain goods particularly difficult to access. So this is the first one, right? So we started by looking at the technique themselves. Then we were interested in the group characteristics, right? So what is the internal decision-making structure of these groups? We know that there's certain groups that have individuals in their leadership that really push for innovation. They've got this drive for innovation. Shamrikyo is a perfect example. The PFLP in the 1970s under George Habas was also very much kind of driven towards innovation. They saw this as a way of gaining a strategic advantage over their adversary. So we know that innovation can be pushed from the top, But we've also seen other groups that are quite decentralized, where individuals themselves have a lot more leeway to innovate, to play with different ideas, and so on. So that's one of the questions we were looking at, is what are these groups, what is the structure of it, and what is the group's kind of outlooks towards innovation. Second one has to do with external environments, so groups that are seen as constantly under pressure may seek to innovate in order to gain like a competitive advantage over their adversaries. At the same time, a group which is constantly under pressure might also not have the amount of kind of freedom to innovate and to change their tactics. So this was one of the areas where in the literature there is a bit of a dichotomy, and this is something that we wanted to push out. The question of constituency is also really interesting, right? And this essentially has to do with, is a new technique or a new procedure going to be accepted by the wider constituency of a group? So a perfect example here is the notion of proxy bomb that was used by the IRA. So for those who are the PIRA, for those who aren't familiar with it, proxy bomb is essentially if you've got an area, you want to commit a VBIED attack, but you can't get close to it for whatever reason, increased security. You kidnap somebody's family and you say, we're going to kill your family unless you drive this car into this area that you can access because you've got the credentials. You're a police officer, you're a soldier. As the car goes through the barriers, goes into the protected zone, you then detonate the bomb at distance, killing the person and achieving that objective. So essentially it's like an unwilling suicide bomber. The PRA employed this strategy on 3 occasions, and what they found is that while tactically it achieved what it wanted, it blew up the police stations or the different targets that they were going after, strategically it was a disaster. People in Northern Ireland, whether they were dissident Republicans, were outraged at this. They were outraged at this technique. They were outraged that their name, their cause was being associated with a technique that was seen as inherently barbaric. Similarly, people in the United States who were funding the PRA were looking at this and saying, this is barbaric and we don't want to fund this. So after 3 attempts, the PRA essentially rejected this technique and took it out entirely from its repertoire and stopped using it. So this is something that we thought was quite interesting as well, right? So not only how the group is going to feel about a particular technique, but how they think their wider constituency, their supporters, are going to feel about that technique. And then the question of ideology. So certain techniques are simply just not compatible with the ideology of the group. Paul Gill, in one of his pieces, gives us an example of a firebomb, a way of creating a firebomb that was advertised as being quite efficient and was essentially being kind of pushed to dissident Republican as a way, as a technique to adopt. But it involved using a condom as part of the fuse. And what they essentially saw is that members of the PRA rejected using this particular technique because they didn't want to store condoms in their house because condoms were prescribed by the Catholic Church at the time. So while this technique itself might seem feasible and leading to achieve the objectives, there might be internal opposition to a particular TTPA. Then the last aspect that we looked at is this notion of the transfers, right? So how is it that this information is shared between one group and another? And the first one had to do with this notion of vicarious transfer, which is essentially looking from afar. So you've got one group of individuals looking at what another group is doing, saying, hijacking a plane is a damn good idea. Maybe we should do that ourselves. The second way that information can be transferred between adversaries is through what we call descriptive transfer. So one group writes down essentially the recipe for a technique. So this is how you hijack a plane. This is how you do a marauding stabbing attack. This is how you commit a vehicle ramming attack, right? And while this seems weird, this is what ISIS propaganda is. It's essentially just writing down recipes for different TTPs. And once these are created, these are not contained to one set of individuals, right? Nothing stops, for example, right-wing extremists from gaining these materials, reading these materials, and the transfer of energy coming, of information coming this way. And I mean, we've got plenty of example of this. I think one of the most interesting one is in Abbottabad, in Bin Laden's hideout, amongst all the pornography that they found. They also found a copy of Begin's book, The Revolt. Right, the first Israeli prime minister wrote his account of the revolt against the British mandate in Palestine, and this was part of the documents that bin Laden had kind of warehoused. So this is where we can see this notion of like descriptive transfer happening. Brilliant. So with this in mind, we've got 3 case studies, and I'm just going to go on the one that I'm quite interested in, which is the drone one. So if you're interested in the Telegram stuff, read the report. If you're interested in the social media bot, read the report. So with the drone question in mind, essentially what we did is we built on some of our previous work in Flying Like a State, which was published in International Affair, work that Emil and I did, where we essentially analyzed 500 pieces of ISIS propaganda that featured drone use. And what we looked at, or what we essentially found, is that ISIS used drones for 3 different purposes. So the first one was on the battlefield as a way of essentially dropping explosives or whatnot on their adversaries. That accounted for about half the images. The second part was as an integral part of its propaganda strategy. And that had 2 elements. One of it was filming attacks, so particularly VPID attacks, where essentially what it would do is it would allow the cinematography of an attack taking place. You could see the vehicle coming, arriving to the target, and exploding, but also a lot of just like flying over territory. And we essentially argued that this was an attempt at showing vertical sovereignty. That if you want to be a state, you need to not only control the ground, you've got to control the air as well. And this use of imagery from drone was actually quite an important aspect of achieving its propaganda strategy. Now, what we also found as part of this project is that there's a great deal of propaganda that came in, there's a great deal of material that came from the Islamic State encouraging its supporters to engage in drone attacks in the West. And this involved very detailed how to do manuals, which involved things like how to build essentially extender for the range, involved things like how to remove all the content from the drone so that if the drone is captured, you don't have a video of you preparing the drone, and so on. So there's many methods here for both descriptive and vicarious pathways for knowledge, right? So like members of right-wing extremist groups will have been aware of ISIS drone use just by sheer aspect of the propaganda that came around it, but they also have pathways through these how-to-do guides. Now, what we thought that was quite interesting here is that while right-wing extremists have used drones as part of their propaganda effort, so for example, filming videos, for example, Adam Waffen has done so, but also as part of reconnaissance for attack, as we saw in Christchurch and during the Unite the Rights rally, and also on January 6th. So in these 3 events, we have documented case of drones being part of this kind of wider recon effort. This kind of notion of using weaponized drone doesn't seem to have been kind of picked up on by right-wing extremists yet. Now, that being said, there are discussions about it. So they're not blind to the existence of this technology, and they're not blind to what this technology can offer. So as for this is the other case study, which is fantastic, and I recommend you read the report. But it's kind of some key takeaways we've got here is that we essentially have 3 case studies that come out, and what we see is that the factors that come into hand are quite different. So in the case of the messaging app, you've got fairly similar technology that is easy to use. There's similarity in the group structures, there's similarity in the communication environment, and there's clear channels for transfer of information, which explains why right-wing extremists adopted the use of Telegram in a very similar fashion as the Islamic State. Whereas when we're looking at UAVs, we start seeing very inverse dynamics. So there's high technical costs and low-cost alternative. And therefore, with the different group structures, different goals, different constituencies, and a lack of descriptive transfer, all those reasons can help us understand why, as it is, drone use by right-wing extremists has been limited to 2 of the 3 ways that they can be used. So the creating propaganda and also recon, and then the bot case study. So essentially, this gives you a brief overview of the report. The report itself is about 6,000 words, so it's about 15-minute read. Recommend you guys read it. Recommend you guys give us some advice if you're interested in this, because this is part of a much larger research project on terrorist innovation that looks at these technologies, but also other technologies like 3D printed weapon and so on. So any thoughts you guys have to this will allow us to push forward our research agenda. Thank you.